Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, a show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Tony O'Sullivan, the CEO of RETN. In this episode, we're going to examine network resiliency and how providers can build networks that withstand outages, whether from someone who forgot to call Miss Utility and dug in the wrong spot, or an anchor dragging on the seafloor, or many other things that can go wrong. Tony explains why it's crucial to have a transparent provider that's willing to share information about their network when they're able to, including maybe the physical locations of their fiber routes and who their upstream providers are. He highlights the importance of planning routes to avoid single points of failure. In particular, he makes the case for terrestrial networks that can serve as alternatives to certain subcable routes, and making sure that you're getting the mix that's best of those two options. Finally, Tony shares some insight on the future of network automation, emphasizing that it's not just about instant provisioning and things like that, but also providing customers with the information that they need to make the most educated purchasing decisions. So before we get started, as always, please take a moment to rate, subscribe, tell a friend to listen to the show. And of course, if you have any suggestions or feedback, find me on LinkedIn. I really do enjoy hearing your thoughts and getting new ideas from folks who reach out. Okay, enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, excellent. I'm really looking forward to this. But before we get into the topic of our conversation today, could you just give us a brief background on yourself and how you came to be the CEO at RETN?
Sure. It was a massive accident of the universe, I guess. So after I left university, I went off and did various sales engineering roles. I then retrained as an accountant, which is where I met a young company called RETN. And eventually joined them in 2007 full time. And I was responsible for their business development and operations in what was then their fledgling Western European market. In 2016, I was promoted to Chief Operating Officer for the group, and then I took over as CEO at the beginning of 2021.
Wow, so you're one of those CEOs who really knows the business, not flying in with some ideas, but from the ground up, huh?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I grew up inside the business and working with RETN was my first stint inside the telecoms industry. But that's actually true for the majority of people inside RETN as a business. Our chief operating officer started as a NOC engineer in the same year as me in 2007. Likewise, our chief technical officer, they were in the same cohort of new junior NOC engineers joining. So we're a bit of an unusual business in that respect that most of the people that are with us have grown up inside the business and know it inside and out.
Yeah, excellent. And a lot of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with you, but for anyone who's not, could you just give us, elevator pitch kind of background on RETN as a company?
So 30-second overview. First RETN was formed in 2003 in London, in the UK. Its primary sales market at the time was selling IP transit into Eastern Europe. And then over the course of the next sort of 5 or 6 years, we started to develop those sales backwards slightly into Western Europe and started to deploy a fiber network rather than running across lease capacity. And then we entered Asia in 2016, and it's all gone on from there. So fast forward to today, we're the 10th largest IP transit company in the world by cone size. If you follow the KIDA rankings, we run a network which is about 110,000 kilometers, running all the way from London across to Japan and little bits in the US as well. But primarily, we're a Europe and Asian network. We run our own fiber network across all of Europe and Central Asia, and then we're running on lease capacity in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, excellent. And we're going to get into how geography impacts what we're talking about, but our major theme for today is network resiliency. So I want to start with sort of the problems with that, right? So just everybody listening to this podcast wants their network, whether it's their network serving customers or as a customer, to be on all the time and to have excellent availability. But could you help us think through really, the actual impacts of network outages and what folks need to keep in mind for that?
Yeah, so of course, this is a really interesting and complex question, and it depends, of course, from whose perspective you see it, and how, of course, you designed your network in the first place. For a company like RETN, where we have designed our network to be as resilient as possible, fortunately, most outages normally just result in a slight change in latency for some customers. And minimal congestion and what have you. But
Hmm.
obviously, if you are a smaller enterprise customer who maybe does not have quite such a diverse and redundant network as we do, then outages can be significantly more impactful. And of course,
Hmm.
it also depends upon what type of outage and what is the cause. When we talk of outages, most of the time these days, we're referring to things relating to some kind of fiber cut or physical circuit interruption along the path of the network.
Right.
And of course, this is because it's the most common type of outage these days. Fortunately, most modern IP and DWDM equipment is relatively reliable, and it stays up most of the time. And when we think it's going to fail, it normally send us an alarm warning to your management system, and you can proactively act and get in there and change whether it's the power supply or whatever needs replacing to bring it back up to speed. But when it
Right.
comes to the actual physical network outages of the fiber or your capacity circuit, of course, it really depends what you have in place in terms of your redundant path. If you don't have a redundant path, then that outage, of course, means there is no service between two of your points of presence. And that's an absolute disaster. If you've got a redundant path which is of a similar length, it might mean just a slight increase in latency. But of course, if your redundant path of a similar length does not have the capacity to carry all of your traffic from both routes,
Hmm.
then of course you're going to get congestion, you're going to get packet loss, and potentially rerouting via a longer, even more circuitous route. So those outages, of course, if you've just got that single route, it's a complete outage. If you've got multiple paths, it can be potentially increased latency. It can be increased congestion, increased packet loss, and of course that then impacts any of your sensitive services that are running across there. If they're latency sensitive, then of course you can have huge issues on this. And of course, many modern applications are very latency sensitive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's, I think, something really worth putting a pin in there, which is that, as you said, equipment has improved in this respect. We're getting now AI tools that can alert your knock to when something's end of life and things like that. I don't see any near future where we can avoid backhoes that dig in the wrong place or whatever, or someone who crashes their car into a pole, utility pole or something, right? So that's always going to happen. All right, so given that this is a reality, again, both from serving my customer side or from I'm an enterprise network manager, IT infrastructure manager, and I need to be aware of this. How should you go about being a provider or finding a provider that can mitigate these risks?
This is a really interesting question as well, but from a very different perspective, because the first thing that we're looking for, and we are a customer as well. We're not just a provider.
Hmm.
As I mentioned,
Hmm.
our Southeast Asian network is run off lease capacity mainly on subsea, because obviously it's impossible to connect Singapore to pretty much anywhere terrestrially.
Right.
So we're a customer as well, and when we go out looking at suppliers, what we're looking for is people that can share with us information. And are as transparent as possible. And there are many providers out there which they're very cagey about what routes they take or what cables they're on,
Absolutely.
how much bandwidth they have on it, or whether they're really the underlying infrastructure owner, and all of this kind of stuff. And if people are not willing to share this information with you, especially under NDA, then that for me is normally a big red flag. That's normally someone we don't wish
Hmm.
to work with, because if we
Yeah.
can't get that route information, we then can't figure out, if we're trying to combine suppliers together and we're looking at supplier diversity, if we really have diversity on the network as well as the supplier diversity.
Mhm. Yeah, this is a really interesting point. So I run across this a lot. One of the things we do at Telegeography is we benchmark enterprise networks for them. Obviously, as part of that, they often are interested in a more holistic rethinking of their network and that sort of thing. And one of the questions we always get is can you help us ensure that we have route diversity? And I say, we almost certainly can't because I can't get the KMZ, or you would say KMZ, I reckon, right? But I can't get the KMZ files, and then we'll say, can you ask your provider for the KMZ files? And very often, even like large financial multinationals, they've asked for these KMZ files, and the providers say no, we can't provide that. And I always wonder what's behind that, because you would think it would be in their best interest to do so, right? And you're saying you're happy to do that as a provider, right? So
So it varies from where. there's a lot of variability within this depending upon where the route is going. There are some countries, for example, where you're not allowed to provide KMZ
Right.
files for
Right.
national security reasons, and some countries that you wouldn't expect as well. Some of the ones you would expect to be more private is less limiting. But normally it comes down to the provider themselves as to whether they're willing to do so or not.
Right.
If, for example, refer to our network map on our website, it is geographically accurate apart from where those countries don't permit us to be geographically accurate.
Right. Right.
And where it's not geographically accurate, we will at least try and give a point to point, whether that's city to city or ILA to ILA map. So you've got some kind of indication as to the route it's taking and get a better visibility. And of course, we're also, if we're using a particular infrastructure provider, we are happy to share who that is. So at least our customer can go, well, look, they're
Can
using
go
gas
the
company
next
A,
level.
and my other
Yeah.
provider is using electricity company B. So the chances are it is diverse for the actual infrastructure underlying it. And I think that's the important bit. Again, it's about, if the NDA is in place, then having that level of transparency, I think, is a really important part of what you're doing. But of course, it's not just about that route diversity. Again, if your provider is saying that they've got diversity, but at the same time their redundant route can only carry 1/4 of the available bandwidth of the primary route, that's not really very well protected. And of course, the further down the stack you go, if you get to layer 3 services to transit and DIA, this is where it becomes more complex because, of course, you're not talking about specific
Mesh network.
so you've
Yeah.
got to dig a lot deeper to actually understand the way that your provider has constructed their network and where they might have overlap with other providers. And you do tend to see this as an issue quite a lot, especially in subsea networks in Southeast Asia, where, of course, sometimes for some territories, there are limited number of cable systems coming in. And then there's limited number of backhauls from a limited number of cable landing stations.
Right.
And of course, when everybody is very price sensitive on products like transit and DIA, of course, everybody gravitates towards the cheaper cable systems. And that means you end up with a critical mass of people building the majority of their network onto the cheaper systems. So if one of those cheaper systems has a subsea cut, a lot of people have a lot of congestion issues.
Right. Right. Yeah. No. Those are all really interesting points, and what one I hadn't emphasized very often is just that the political fractured regulatory environment makes this difficult. That there's some places where we're just literally not even allowed to share this level of detail, and that can certainly be frustrating. But also, definitely to your point, that there's a more complex sort of issue here than just what street is my fiber going down, but what is the entire situation, especially getting into these any-to-any services like you mentioned. And that's something I want to hit a little bit later, but I think the industry is working towards improving that across the board. Let's also talk though, especially since you brought up regulatory issues about security and compliance and how that relates to your network resiliency, as well as this sort of more physical infrastructure piece.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one that changes from territory to territory and depends upon where you operate. But as a real base level, for me, you've got to be looking at providers that have ISO certifications, so that you know that their basic security procedures are up to check. But on the actual compliance side itself, and in terms of where they're operating, simple questions like, are you licensed to provide telecom services within that country?
Good
The
step first. Yeah, yeah,
the number of
exactly.
times you come across companies that are not actually licensed to do so, and they assume that just because it's a B2B service that everything will be okay. And for me, that's one of the first checks you should be doing. This is know your vendor approach, the same as you should be doing with your clients. Understand their business, understand are they able to help you legally in the place they're operating, because that's the first step.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And then you mentioned ISO, but on the security end as well as we're thinking about network resilience not just as availability, but of course a secure one as well. How do you think about that from a provider perspective? Obviously, some of the security onus is on the enterprise's setup. Are they running things like SASE or whatever? But how do you start that from the ground up as a provider?
So there is a lot of responsibility on the customer, but at the same time, it's our responsibility to help them along that journey. And for us, we're very much at the more wholesale end of the industry. We do have enterprise customers, but they tend to be those kind of enterprise customers who buy like wholesale.
By like carriers,
You know,
absolutely.
they understand networks, they understand what they're doing, but you still got to help them along the way. And this is,
Yeah.
this is a collaborative effort, because for us these days, if we're thinking, for example, DDoS attacks on our network, volumetric attacks, because we have such a scale of bandwidth are not our biggest issue these days. It tends to be more targeted attacks against specific parts of the infrastructure where you tend to see issues. But
Right.
for our customers, smaller volumetric attacks can still be problematic. And so the question is, what can we do as a provider to ensure that our customers are willing to protect themselves? And that can be
Hmm.
providing certain tools and products free of charge. It can be ensuring that DDoS mitigation for their whole network is something which is considered to be just a you might as well, as opposed to wow, that's an expensive add-on.
Hmm.
This is, I think, the stage that the industry has got to, where DDoS mitigation these days is no longer just it's no longer this desirable kind of golden egg add-on that everybody must have. You know, if you're going into the old stereo shops, so they're trying to sell you the gold plated cables,
Right.
some ridiculously inflated price. It's a small add-on which ultimately is there to protect your network,
Hmm.
but in turn, that also protects our network as well. Because whilst we not, on the backbone of our network, we might not even notice significant volumetric attacks. Of course, if we have a customer who's sitting on the end of a 10G link to a small offsite metro data center in a city, and we've got two customers on the end of that link, and one of them is experiencing a smallish volumetric attack, it's going to impact the other customer as well. So by helping to
Hmm.
protect them, we're also helping to protect all of our other customers as well along the way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. That the security landscape, the threat landscape, is so fractured and so many facets of it now that you can't just say, okay, well, I have these specific security products and I'm done. It starts really from the ground up across the whole industry. For your provider's provider has to be thinking about this as well, right? So yeah, and the last sort of few things to work through in terms of making sure your network is resilient. So you brought up the additional difficulties when you're not just dealing with, like, say, a point-to-point wavelength, but when you're dealing with DIA, for example, that's being delivered over a mesh network. How do you have to think about network design in those cases to ensure resiliency when you might not know, okay, this is the path that I need to protect, for example?
Yeah, and this is a really it's a difficult question to answer, mainly because there are so many different approaches you can take to the question.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I would put this more from the perspective of, if I were an outside consulting advising a client as to how to buy transit, how I would look at it first of all, or DIA. And the first question you've got to be asking yourself is to understand, first of all, who your providers are getting their service from. If they're a tier two, who are they buying their transit from? If it's the same company, well, you're probably going to have a problem. If
Right.
in our case, we have one remaining upstream left, which is 3356, the old level 3 AS number. If you're going to
Hmm.
go to another provider who've got the same one, well, you're going to have that same issue there. So you should be at least looking at two providers, and this is something that we always recommend to our customers. Sometimes you'll get a customer come to you and say, "Hey, look, if I put all of my transit with you, what can you do?" And our answer is,
Hmm.
don't put all of your transit with us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Because ultimately, it doesn't matter how many people say, "Oh, look, we've got 100% uptime." It's not real.
Hmm. Hmm.
People can
Hmm.
promise it. They can provide a financial credit should it not have 100% uptime.
Right.
But the simple fact is, every network has the potential to fail at some point. And if your access service is critical for your business, you should be de-risking yourself by having more than one provider. And that's the starting
Yeah.
point. And then it's
Hmm.
understanding, how are those providers providing that service. If you look at what we do within Europe, the vast majority of that is all our own infrastructure. Um, so even if we do have a fiber cut on a major route, we have the capacity to spin up additional capacity on another fiber route, because we control the DWDM network. We're running a
Hmm.
full Infinera backbone. It's a case of logging onto DNA, spinning up additional circuits. Dead simple, dead easy. If you're buying from
Right.
a provider which is buying least capacity, they're normally their potential to spin up additional capacity on another route to reduce congestion in the event of a fiber cut is going to be very, very difficult. And honestly,
Hmm.
that's the same issue that we see when we're in Southeast Asia and we're reliant on subsea, because we are not a consortium member on subsea cables in Southeast Asia. So all we understand is that when we are building our network in Southeast Asia, we have to deliberately overbuild the network, and therefore not sell to a similar amount of utilization as we would in Europe, because
Hmm.
we're conscious of the risks that we could face. So that's the first thing from your customer's perspective. More than one provider. Make sure they don't have similar upstream chain of providers, and that's the first part. The second part, if you're looking at that, is then to understand, are they running their own infrastructure, and if so,
Hmm.
what infrastructure are they on?
Hmm.
So if you're
Right.
just connecting
Right.
to them in a single point of presence, how are they connecting out of that point of presence, and making sure you have diversity within your providers there? And to come back to the point about Southeast Asia again, we see this time and time again. You'll see customers that have bought from 2 or 3 different providers in Southeast Asia and then discover that they were all on the same subsea systems. And so the moment you get a couple of subsea outages, everybody's got the same issue. A lot of congestion
Hmm.
on a single cable system that's left, or potentially stuff going halfway around the world rather than going more direct.
Right. Yeah. No, it's funny because everything you're saying is very well aligned with how we see the world at telegeography, right? So, one of the things that we're tracking, of course, is downstream and upstream providers and mapping out who's connected. And then also, of course, right, just the physical geography of networks around the world. You mentioned, terrestrial Europe. Well, that's a situation where certainly it's important to understand your provider's network map, but it's also a relatively straightforward proposition, right? So across Europe, there's affordable wavelengths, 100 gig or whatever across the entire region, and there's a lot of alternatives. You get to a place like Southeast Asia, and there's quite a few physical, political, and otherwise market bottlenecks, right? So I
Correct.
think a lot of folks, even in the industry, don't think through that physical geography. I think as much as they need to.
Yeah, 100%. And this, even though you mentioned in Europe, there is a wide array of providers, there's a wide array of capacity on the market, but even then, people get stuck into the same corridors, and the same patterns of buying. And it's been really interesting to see over the last 12 months the number of new cable systems that have been announced on flat routes, for
Hmm.
example. And
Hmm.
many of the big infra companies in Europe that are pushing towards new fiber routes connecting the different flap cities. And of
Hmm.
course, they're all pushing this same point of view, which is the existing systems running on similar ducts and got similar paths. They've got similar single points of failure in particular cities. But of course, then the question comes about, has there been overbuild on this? And is there the necessary customer base to deploy all of this, especially when many of these routes already existed through alternative infrastructure combinations?
Right. Yeah, yeah, you bring up a really good point, which is that in the wholesale market, seeking maximum radical diversity might lower prices to an unsustainable level potentially, right? So there is a little bit of give and take in the market there, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So, what talk maybe more about Retten's network specifically, because as you said, you started out sort of getting Europe into sort of Asia and Central Eurasia kind of locations. How have you thought about that as the leader of this company and thinking like where is it most advantageous for us to build, to think about network, to not do what we're saying might run the risk of just tanking prices, but rather to truly sort of make the network more resilient across this region.
Yeah, so if we go back to the very early days of Retin, the reason why we were successful is because we listened to our customers more than other people. We listened to the
Mm-hmm.
challenges they were having, and we understood that if we wanted to do something which was going to have value, it was to build where people were telling us they couldn't find the options, or to
Mm-hmm.
come up with ways where we could circumvent problems that they were currently experiencing. And this is how we built our network in the first place, is why we were particularly successful. And after we started selling layer one services, after moving to a fiber network in 2009, this is how we built the network from day one. It was finding these alternative paths, maybe not going with people who could provide you with the full route across 5 different countries, and understanding how you could piece together existing infrastructure to build something that was truly unique, diverse, alternative, in many cases shorter, and of course also opened up potential new markets along the way. So it's commercially advantageous for us
Mm-hmm.
to do so. Um, and that's what we did. And we made our name really by connecting countries via terrestrial paths in particularly unique ways. And this is how we developed the company when starting to think about Asia as well. Our first deployments to Asia were routes across Kazakhstan all the way to the Chinese border.
Right.
And even today, we are the only company running a homogenous DWDM network all the way from the China-Kazakh border all the way back to Europe. And this provides us with certain advantages. When we look at the way that IP networks are constructed in Southeast Asia, for example, Most of them, of course, when they want to connect to Europe, they're using the traditional routes via the Red Sea. They're using
Right.
SIMWE 5, they're using AA1. Those that have already bought into it are using Peace as well. Some people were splashed out a little bit more and decided to go for that wonderful BBG EIG combination, which went via Mumbai, but obviously it had
Hmm.
quite a cost to it. And then, of course, the other path is to go back via the US. We approached it slightly differently because we'd built our infrastructure all the way to the Chinese border. We then
Right.
started looking at moving IP traffic terrestrially back to Europe. And this was one of our key selling points from our point of view,
Hmm.
is the fact that when you do see these multiple fiber cuts connecting Europe to Asia, most of our IP traffic just skips back to Hong Kong and then heads terrestrially back to Europe. And in many cases, there is a minimal, if non-existent, latency impact. And for us, this
Hmm.
has worked really well. When you had the subsea issues at the beginning of 24, when SIMWE 5 was out, AA1 was out, the BBG EIG combination was out as well, all because of these cuts in the Red Sea at the same time. Um, for us, we saw clients that have been dual homed between us and other tier ones and large tier twos, where all of a sudden all of their European traffic was going via us, because for the other networks, that traffic was going to the US and then across to Europe. And in one case, we understood it went via Australia to the US and across to Europe.
Yeah, talk about latency there. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and it's something again that aligns well with how we think of the world from the telegeography perspective. For a long time, is just I've got over my shoulder the submarine cable map. We don't map terrestrial networks because it's too complex. That would make this map look like a spaghetti, right? And for lack of data too, I should say. But there is this thinking that, okay, well, this is simple. If I need to get from Frankfurt to Singapore, I go down, and that's that makes sense in some respects. But like you said, there's quite a few spots that are bottlenecks there for a bunch of reasons. One of which is simply that it's getting really crowded, right? And that makes cable routing and maintenance and that sort of thing very difficult. But then the other side of the token, and this is where I want to ask you about how you guys have overcome this, is that digging trenches, hanging things on poles across different countries, right? The cable people have to deal with the landing stations, right? And there's different regulations there. Have you had a lot of difficulty over these past like 20 years, nearly of doing this, of getting terrestrial, fiber laid down across a bunch of different political jurisdictions, across landscapes that might require digging or poles? Take us a bit through the challenges there.
I mean, of course, there are complexities there, but where we've tended to build our own fiber tends to be more in open greenfield sites. We are not in the business of
Right.
fiber across, well-developed Western Europe, because there's no
Hmm.
point. There's plenty of infrastructure companies who've already done it, whether it's railways, motorways, power companies, gas companies, oil companies, you name it. They've already built the
Yeah.
infrastructure, so you're just buying fibers on those routes. But when it comes to open territories, it becomes a little bit easier, certainly on the construction side. But obviously, the
Hmm.
permitting side, yes, it is complex. It does require work. It does require engagement with local government and also local players as well, because some of them are not necessarily going to be happy to see you in their backyard unless you
Absolutely.
present it as an opportunity for them as well, which
Hmm.
is what we've always done. We've always worked really, really well in partnership with different carriers around the world, because we're not there to just go along and steal all the business. We're there to
Right.
bring business to them as well. It works in both directions. So yeah, there are challenges. It can take a little bit longer sometimes, but
Hmm.
ultimately the finished product is normally a more optimal product. Um,
Right.
and whilst there are costs involved with doing so, and yes, there are different and uh, varied cost bases from subsea, um, ultimately what you end up with is a system that's typically, if there is a fiber cut, a repair happening in 4 to 8 hours. And where you're at today
Mm-hmm.
with the subsea systems, where you're talking repairs, if you're lucky, happening within 12 weeks, but in some cases, depending upon, it's not just permitting these days. Cable ships these days. It's also about can you get permits to go into the waters and actually do the repair? Because
Right.
sometimes the geopolitical winds have changed since the cable was initially laid. So
Hmm.
things have changed in that respect, and that's what we're seeing. A colleague of mine, Sam Sham, who's responsible for our network in Southeast Asia, did a very interesting presentation at the Hong Kong Network Operator Group last year, where he was talking about the unseen cost that you get from relying solely on subsea systems, where potentially they're out for 6 months at a time. You're paying for these cables anyway, because of course it's a force majeure clause in the contract.
Right.
Your customers, if they're buying IP transit traffic from you, of course, they're not paying you for it because they're not seeing that burst traffic. They're not able to burst because you've got constricted capacity. And so it's the lost opportunity cost you've got. And this is why we're saying that, building a proper network, even though it might have a slightly higher initial cost base, actually in the long run, is beneficial to your bottom line because your customers can continue to use the network no matter what, and it means you always win when there are these subsea outages against competitors who are maybe just relying on subsea. And
Yeah.
this is what we've seen time and time again.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point that that for all the difficulties that all of us in this industry have about doing a truck roll is still faster than getting a ship out to the middle of the ocean in some respects, right? And I should say, to your points earlier about you being a customer in certain regions, like obviously not to put words in your mouth, but I think I hear you saying like this is a both and situation, right? You're saying that you need to have the diversity, not just be relying on terrestrial, not just being relying on
Yes.
subcable where you can have that, right?
100%. There's place for both in the market, and there
Hmm.
is no one answer to every single problem. There are different ways
Yeah.
you can approach it depending upon what you're thinking about your own market strategies as well. Obviously, if you're going into the market and saying, "Hey, look, we're the cheapest provider out there," then obviously there are going to be some solutions which are off the table to you. Um, from
Hmm.
our perspective, our positioning, the way we see ourselves in the market, is we're providing a fantastic product at a pretty good price, but we'll never be the
Hmm.
cheapest, but
Yeah.
we'll be
Yeah.
pretty close to the best for a reasonable amount of money. And that's the market positioning we're looking at. I want to be in a position where we can be proud, we could speak proudly in front of our customers and say, yeah, our network stood up when others failed you. Because for us,
Hmm.
we're still a relatively small organization. We'd much rather retain the customers we have through great service and great network than have to try and win them back after a disaster.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And as I've been a pricing analyst at telegeography for much of my career there in some shape or form, and certainly there's always a range, and people sometimes push back on us of why is there a range, and it's like, well, the range exists in the market for reasons, right? And that I'll leave it to you guys, like sort of what those reasons might be in some cases, right? You know what I mean? But ranges in prices aren't just random, right? There, so
And
there,
again, this becomes obvious when you do your analysis properly, when you try and understand what the providers are actually giving you for the money. If you're seeing
Mhm.
that a provider in territory A is half the price of a provider territory in the same territory, but they've only got two subsea systems coming into the territory, whereas provider B has got five subsea systems. Well, there's your answer.
Yeah.
For any island nation, if you take Singapore as a great example. If you've got less than five systems coming into the territory, you're at risk, as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm. Hmm.
We've seen an increase in the number of subsea outages over the last couple of years, and there are some places where we're seeing persistent subsea outages. And whether this is due to increased shipping volume, due to other issues, it's real. It's there, and you need to
Right.
build your network accordingly.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think this is exactly right, and looking at the world from that perspective, again, doesn't matter whether you're a wholesale provider, an ISP, or a large multinational. You need to sit down and look at the map and look at the provider map, right, and sort of do this math, as it were, right, and understand exactly what all of this means, and that very few sort of companies' explicit goal is I need the absolute cheapest network that I can get. There's situations where I'm just, throwing bandwidth at something and that's the right thing for this particular leg, but it's really about understanding the cost to performance ratio, right?
a hundred, 100% yes on this. The simple fact is that there's not a customer on earth which is never going to question price. Those kind of businesses don't exist because they go out of business very quickly if that's
Hmm.
their attitude towards procurement. But you've got to understand what value you are getting for your money, and also what risk you are prepared to take to reduce that price.
Right. Right.
Because as
Absolutely.
you reduced your cost base, there is a potential increase in risk. We think we present that sort of perfect happy medium. For some customers, they'll want something slightly different,
Hmm.
and that's a choice for them. But again, they can only make that decision if they understand the right questions to ask whilst purchasing, um, and also if the providers they're speaking to provide them with that transparent level of openness. Sorry, that the openness and transparency that
Yeah.
allows them to evaluate the criteria properly.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That is the key. But I love the idea of people being able to pour over network maps and think through, for a bunch of reasons that we've been talking about. Like, it's not just about latency, although that can be really important. It's not just about the bottlenecks, although that can be really important. But this like holistic view of really how should my network function geographically, provider wise, all of those things. It's a lot more complex than I think some people give it. The attention level of, so.
Yeah, and this is one of the interesting things that I've seen in my time in the industry. From the early days where people were just, what's your best price and can you meet us in these 4 data centers?
Hmm.
The industry
Hmm.
has very much changed, and I put this down in a large part to procurement practices from the OTTs,
Mm.
from the big OTT,
Yes,
which have started
for
to spread
sure.
across the rest of the industry.
Yep.
And whilst we as a very large wholesale provider have always thought in a similar manner to them, what we're seeing is that kind of attitude going further down, and I think that's a fantastic thing. I love
Well, they
customers.
have the purchasing power to force the industry to work in a certain way, right? So,
They have the
yeah.
purchasing power to ensure that infrastructure is built which can meet their demands, which
Hmm.
fortunately also meets the demands of many other people. Not every time, not
Right.
everything they do is right for everybody else, but there is a certain level of their network design philosophy which can be filtered down to smaller scale customers and absolutely makes sense. And the fact that
Mhm.
this infrastructure is being built around their requirements means that is also possible for those smaller scale customers. I enjoy nothing more than speaking to a customer that really, really understands what they want from a network,
Mhm.
even when you can't necessarily meet it. Because when you can't meet that, you're learning something new. You're learning about an
Right.
opportunity where you're going, okay, so there's something missing in the market. They're telling me that they want this and they can't find it anywhere, and we can't
Right.
provide it. But maybe we should build it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That is how it gets done. Excellent. All right. So Tony, as we're sort of coming to an end here, I want us to, before we're done, look a little bit towards the future. I like to do that often with my guests at the end of the podcast. Obviously the entire industry right now is talking a lot about automation, and automation can mean a lot of different things, right? But from your perspective, I want to talk about it in moving toward this world where across your providers and your providers, there's this seamless integration of ordering, of provisioning, of monitoring, right? So it's not just, I think, anymore the vision of the future about being able to make sure that my order made it through for the right service and that sort of thing. But do my trouble tickets make it through different layers without faxing someone? Just from your position of running a company involved in this market, how do you see that developing? And where are we really? Where do we need to get to?
So I find it fascinating the way you framed the question, because you introduced a lot of nuance there, which is not
Hmm.
normally what you hear when people discuss network automation. For most people, their vision of network automation is this automated platform where one person's platform does everything. You log into a portal, provision it automatically, and all of a sudden your service pops up and it's ready to go, and you
Right.
can change it whenever you want, and it changes instantly, and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't really think that is necessarily the um, likely future use of automated
This
networks.
is kind of what I'm getting at. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm yet to come across, one of the things that we always prided ourselves on, and we have done for many, many years, is how quickly we deliver services.
Mhm.
Even 10 years ago, we were promising customers that layer one services would be delivered within a week. More often than not, they were delivered within a couple of working days. Our record was a couple of terabits
Well,
within a few hours. Again,
yeah.
because we chose the right technology platforms to allow us to do so, combined with the fact that being a relatively small company, we don't have complex processes inside the business that
Yeah,
prevent this
absolutely.
kind of stuff from
Nimble. Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
But those cases are relatively exceptional. They
Hmm.
are a customer that's planned their network badly and has had a subsea fiber cut and desperately needs a couple of terror on a single system. The
Right.
majority of customers don't wish to change their network on a day by day basis. They don't need stuff to happen immediately. But what they do need on a regular basis is information. And this is where I think
Mm-hmm.
you've got it right. This is where
Hmm.
I think the APIs between different networks and different network platforms will develop. It's about sharing that information. So, obviously today, nobody can have network everywhere. There's no truly global carrier. We're all relying on other people. It's one of the wonderful things about the industry. It's one of the wonderful things about the internet, the way that we all have to collaborate and share network to deliver services for our customers. And it's a really, really great and fascinating thing. But one of the most frustrating things can be, if you've got a customer who's got, a circuit running with me, let's say London to, I don't know, Canada, where we don't have network. And so we're having to rely upon an American carrier in New York to help us with that long last mile into Canada. And there may be a fiber cut on this, and getting
Hmm.
that information from their NOC to our NOC to the customer. And that's often a very manual process. It's not fully
Absolutely.
automated. And once we can build that into the chain, that's where it becomes super interesting, because this is what customers are really, in my opinion, really want from their automation. They want information. They don't need things to be provisioned instantly, because in most cases, you're still waiting for a data center to deliver a cross connect. Right? This is
Right. Right.
the
Absolutely.
job
Yeah.
in that. But they do want
Somebody's got to walk down the hallway with that Cat 6, right?
but they
Yeah.
do want to be able to go onto your website. They want to be able to see what routes you have. They want to be able to check your outage history. They want to be able to get a budgetary offer for it. They want to understand what the SLA is that comes with it. They want information, because that is what allows them to be an educated purchaser.
Right. Hmm.
And this is what we've been doing for years manually. Our latest version of our customer portal has enabled a lot of these features automatically, so customers can just log in and check this stuff themselves. And this is
Yeah.
where we hope to build further features. That's where we think, with our place in the industry, the automation layer will lie. And yes, sure, we will get to a stage at some point where also bits of the network, we're already provisioning some services, automatically inside the business, following a couple of manual processes. But this is where I think our priorities lie. It's about, how do we serve our customers better for what they really want.
Hmm.
Um, and that's what I hope to develop further. And that's what I'm really interested in seeing as the industry progresses as well. It's been really fascinating the last couple of years how it has moved forward.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I'll say once again, we seem really well aligned here. That it's been my experience that there are industries, entertainment, retail, things like that, where bandwidth on demand is really interesting, but that in most industries it's not like you say, it's that most industries I pretty much know what bandwidths I need around the world, and I have time to get my network going. Sure, they don't love 30, 60, 90 day provisioning time, obviously, right? But what it is really about is what we've been talking about, is network resiliency. If I could automate that process and make sure that, or not even just resiliency, but performance, right? So like, obviously performance is part of resiliency, but we're not just talking about, okay, I have an outage, I need to figure out which provider is ultimately responsible, but something's not working exactly the way that I think it is, and we need to understand why very quickly, right? So yeah.
Exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, this has been really fascinating, Tony. Thank you very much. To end the show here, just don't lay your cards on the table if you have a super special route or anything like that. But what key developments do you see for your region of operation, kind of the Eurasian region, and RETN in particular, over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think we will see an increase in terrestrial routes generally across
Hmm.
South Asia and Central Asia. Obviously, these days what we tend to see is, or what we've seen in the past, is primarily routes connecting Europe to Asia. But there has been a limited amount in terms of intra-Asia connectivity. And I think some of the
Hmm.
geopolitics has changed over the last 5 years. And also some people have started to see more of the risks from some of the subsea infra. We will see more and more of that in particular areas. But I also see we're going to see a further proliferation of subsea cables. Obviously, there are still limitations because of some of the geopolitical issues we've already discussed.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see the way the OTTs are changing that connectivity landscape. And
Hmm.
of course, this also all aligns with how different regions of the world and their economies are growing, and their usage of the internet has the potential to grow as well. That's where we're
Yep.
starting to see those real changes. And this is where I think if you watch where the OTTs are tending to build out into, that's where you can see some of the future starting. A great example is, if
Yeah.
you were watching the OTTs 4 or 5 years ago, you'd have been watching very carefully what was going on in Lisbon, and now you're
Hmm.
starting to see
Hmm.
that develop as a market, of course, because that's where the backhaul is coming from. And now it's not just about OTTs, but of course it's about lots of African carriers coming into Lisbon as well. Um,
Right.
and this is where I see those changes happening. I also see a lot more diversity and a lot less dependence upon the traditional routes. I see some of the bigger internet hubs starting to become a little bit more diversified. If we look in Europe, typically for the last 20 odd years, it's always been Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and London, which have been the core interconnection hubs. And now we're starting to see a lot more interconnection happening on the local layer, which I think is a fantastic thing. It
Hmm.
introduces much more resilience into the network.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, the arc of the internet, as it were, over the last 25 years has been away from central hubs, and especially as those hyperscalers have pushed further and further out. Networkers providers are the ones who have to respond, right? So I think we've long lived in a world where there was a tendency of hyperscalers or even just real estate, REITs and whatnot, to drop a data center in a place that made sense for various data center reasons, and then the fiber providers have to figure out how to make that work. Right? So I think I see better sort of interplay between those communities now, and so I think that's exciting, right? So.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Tony, it's been a pleasure. Listeners that want to keep up with you or what's up at RETN, how can they find you guys?
Uh, Very easy way, website, there's our newsletter, LinkedIn. We're there in all the obvious places. And of course, come and see us at conferences. We attend all the major conferences, always happy to speak to people, even if it's just discussing the state of networking, complaining about certain different aspects of the industry that aren't working. We're here to share our thoughts and share our experience.
Yeah, I've had many a beer about this topic, and that's why I can bring it up now, right? So, yeah, excellent. All right, Tony, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.